You're watching the Air and Space Channel.
August 27th, 1945. The war is over. Though official surrender has yet to be signed, it is now simply a formality. The American destroyer, the USS Blue, is off the coast of the Japanese main island of Honshu when it is approached by a vessel. The crewmen aboard the USS Blue are astonished at the size of this Japanese submarine, the I400, which rivals their ship in size. The captain of the I400 offers his surrender, and this amazing piece of naval technology officially becomes a U.S. war prize. But little do the Americans know what amazing secrets it hides inside, and the terrible damage it was ready to inflict so close to home. While the war in Europe is one of battlefields and bombardments, the Pacific War is a very different conflict. With thousands of miles separating the two main combatants, much of this war is fought at sea, on islands, and in the skies above both. 5 months after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Jimmy Doolittle led a formation of 16 bombers on a mission launching from the USS Hornet in waters 650 nautical miles away from Japan, and led them to the Japanese home island of Honshu. There, 15 of the planes dropped 4 bombs each, 3 of which were high explosive munitions, and the 4th a bundle of incendiaries. The attack did little damage, but boosted American morale significantly. While Japanese officials downplayed the attack in their media, it proved that the heart of their empire was not invulnerable.
Well, it was around June of '42 when this plan came up. The original plan was to design and build 18 of these I400 class submarines. And the idea was to take the war to the American homeland. You know, you had the Doolittle Raiders, you know, raiding Tokyo in '42, which caused great consternation. So the Japanese thought, well, they came to our homeland and they bombed us. Well, we got to take the war to the American mainland. We want to build 18 of these huge submarines, and we're going to attack the vital installations: San Francisco, New York, New York City, Washington, D.C. You know, send our planes over there and bomb these the areas and scare the hell out of the Americans. You know, not only for well, for propaganda purposes too. You know, they couldn't hope to really do much, but the fact that the Doolittle Raiders came over to Tokyo and caused devastation, you know, panic. You know, the Japanese wanted to do the same thing.
So Japanese submarine service in general was badly used. It was used for resupplying islands, picking up, you know, pilots that may have for rescue services and that kind of stuff, but mostly like a supply cow. You know, it was very, very badly used. And so, like I say, this particular I400, 401, and her sister ships were designed for a particular mission.
The concept of the Sentoku I400 class submarine came from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Imperial Navy. He proposed the idea in early 1942 in hopes of taking the war to the American homeland. The plan was to create 18 of these enormous submarines, which could make a round trip to the United States' west coast without refueling and carrying at least 2 attack aircraft. It was an ambitious proposal. In just 2 months, plans were drawn up. 5 would go into production, with the first of these, the I400, being completed in December of 1944. The I401 was finished just a few days later. The I400 class were the largest submarines ever built, at 390 feet long, and would remain the largest until the 1960s. It had 4 2,250 horsepower engines that carried enough fuel to go around the world 1.5 times. The on-deck hangar would have enough room to store 3 aircraft, and the forward port side held a collapsible crane to hoist those aircraft back inside. The aircraft that the I-400 and its sister ships would carry were Aichi M6A Seirens, specially designed with folding wings. The two-seaters would feature a V12 engine based off of a Daimler-Benz DB601 and feature detachable floats. They would carry 850 kilograms in either torpedoes or bombs and a 13mm machine gun. They would be launched via an air catapult on the forward deck. Mounting pressure on Japanese forces by the Allies would take a toll on the I-400 project. Only 4 of the planned 18 submarines would ever begin production.
The war situation got really bad, and so they only wound up completing 2 of them, 400 and 401.
The I-400, 401, and their complement of aircraft wouldn't strike at naval yards like at Pearl Harbor. They also wouldn't strike at the American homeland itself. Instead, they would strike a vital installation that would be both close to home for the U.S. and a good strategic target, the Panama Canal. The 77-kilometer-long canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans is key for the Americans to wage their war against Japan. Constructed over a 10-year period beginning in 1903, the canal falls within the bounds of the Panama Canal Zone, 553 square miles of U.S.-controlled territory. Its sophisticated lock system allowed ships to move from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific via 2 lanes in a 20 to 30-hour transit, rather than having to traverse the 10,000-mile journey down past the southern tip of South America near Cape Horn. Due to the canal's strategic importance, it had been heavily guarded, with anti-torpedo nets and naval mines in nearby waters, anti-aircraft gun positions, long-range radar stations on each coast, gun batteries, aircraft warning stations, and 65,000 troops on the ground. But as the war went on and Japan's strength dwindled, the defense of the canal and its locks were no longer much of a priority. In January of 1944, an American POW who had guarded the canal was interviewed by Commander Yasuo Fujimori. The POW confirmed that the defenses had weakened and that air patrols were infrequent at best. With blueprints provided by a Japanese engineer who had worked on the creation of the canal, a team of shipping engineers studied the blueprints to determine where to strike. While the Pacific side would be the easier target, the Gatun locks on the Atlantic side would offer a chance to cause more damage that may take up to 6 months to repair. In June of 1945, a full-scale wooden model of the Gatun Locks Gate is constructed at Nanaowan, and over 15 days the submarine and air crews trained at launching the Siren aircraft from the catapult and bombing the wooden gates. The I-400 and I-401, along with the smaller I-13 and I-14, carrying 2 Siren aircraft each, would sail to the Gulf of Panama over the course of 2 months. When they were 100 nautical miles off the coast of Ecuador, all 10 Sirens would be deployed before daybreak, using the catapult launch mechanism on the front of the submarines. The 10 Sirens would fly across the northern coast of Colombia and turn around over the Caribbean Sea, where they would head toward Colón, Panama, where the Gatun locks of the Panama Canal are located. Once they launched their weapons at the gate, the pilots would rendezvous with the submarine again.
They would get very close, and the crane would actually hoist the airplane from the water and put it on the deck, and they would be disassembled and put back in the hangar. And no one would know where it came from, you know. The Americans would think, where in the hell did these planes come from? You know, we haven't detected any Japanese aircraft carriers, so they would be totally blindsided by this whole thing.
And you got to understand that the Japanese pilots that were participating, they were participating basically in the second Pearl Harbor is what it was going to be. You know, the Panama Canal would have been the second Pearl Harbor. The world would have never imagined that this would have happened. Once again, the war in Europe's ended. The shipping is coming from Europe and the European campaign now through the Panama Canal, and now we've got to block that off is basically what their plan is and stuff, which is a great plan.
I thought the plan was brilliant because number one, it was audacious and it was daring, and technically it could be accomplished. They have been training for it. In 45, I mean, Japan was just holding on. You know, there was no chance at that time that they could have won the war. And yet they continued to be on the offensive, especially in terms of striking back. And it got to a point where a lot of these military leaders knew that the war was lost because they lost Saipan. But they continued to prosecute the war. They didn't want to lose face. They had to continue until they were told to stop.
It was this perspective that made the planners of the Panama Canal mission decide on a very desperate tactic, a sacrifice play involving their Syrian pilots on board the submarines.
Initially, they were supposed to attack the Panama Canal with torpedoes. But the plan was that when they were assembling the attack team, there weren't enough qualified, skilled torpedo bomber pilots. There just weren't any. They've all been killed, shot down, or whatever, but this is after Midway. And so they had a dilemma. To train a torpedo bomber pilot to a very professional level took years. And here they're going to attack the Panama Canal with torpedoes. Theoretically, it was possible, but it all hinged on the ability of the pilots, the pilots to deliver that torpedo, and that was the stickler right there. They didn't have anyone trained enough to do that. So at the end, it was decided that they were going to have the pilots ram the locks with their aircraft to assure the destruction of the locks. And the pilots themselves, they didn't realize that it was a kamikaze mission until they were well into the training program. And they weren't very happy when they found out, because kamikaze pilots weren't ordered. They were volunteers. But in this sense, in the I400, they weren't told that it was a kamikaze mission. In fact, they weren't told at all. They had to learn it in an obtuse way. When they saw technicians removing the bomb racks from the airplanes and affixing bombs that could not be removed, they were just attached permanently. Then they got the suspicion, hey, what is this? You know, there's no bomb release mechanism. Then they figured out, oh, this is a kamikaze attack. So Ensign Takahashi, who was one of the pilots on the mission, stormed into his superior's office and raised hell. And that was a total breach of etiquette. He was an ensign screaming at the lieutenant, what the hell do you think this is? What do you think you're doing?
But for the moment, the pilots aboard the I-400 will not have to sacrifice themselves to attack Panama. With the fall of Okinawa in late June of 1945, the Japanese home islands were now entirely vulnerable to an Allied assault. The Japanese Naval General Staff ordered the I-400 and I-401 back towards home. They would be joining the smaller I-13 and I-14 on an attack against the 15 American aircraft carriers gathered at Ulithi Atoll. But would it still be a kamikaze mission?
The pilots were lined up at a ceremony before their departure, and Admiral Ozawa presented each of them with a ceremonial kamikaze dagger similar to this. And it was inscribed on the sheath, Admiral Ozawa, and Special Attack Kamikaze. And when the pilots each received the dagger, they knew that it was a one-way mission. And so they had to accept their fate right then and there. They're not coming back. It's a one-way mission.
If demanding the sacrifice of their pilots wasn't enough, even further steps were being taken to ensure the success of the mission. Cunning and treacherous steps that might make an already questionable attack seem even more irredeemable.
The ships I400 and 401 are ordered to the northern Japan, a base called Maiju. And what happens there at that base is the crew are actually given a 3-day liberty to go 3-day liberty. Meanwhile, the mechanics stay behind and they're painting the aircraft from the green color on the Saron with the red Hanamaru, which is the red, if you want to call it meatball, on the side of the aircraft, to silver, full silver aircraft with U.S. stars and bars.
For Ensign Takahashi, it's a step too far.
So he demanded to know who was behind this. And he was very, very angry because they were going on this kamikaze mission and they're going to be flying in an aircraft disguised as American planes. And he had told me he thought it was very despicable. He says, we're Japanese and we don't want to be flying an aircraft with American colors. That we're Japanese, we're going to die. We want to die in our aircraft painted in Japanese markings and not in American colors. He thought that was just really, really low down. And he confronted his superior officer about that, and they had a big argument. And he was told that they had to do this in order to ensure that they would be able to escape detection and hit their targets. And I also learned that the reasoning behind the false colors was that, well, heck, the Americans were indiscriminately bombing Japanese cities. They were committing war crimes. So because they're doing that, why should we, observe the international code? So that was the reasoning.
At that time, these aircraft would be launched without pontoons and would resemble P-51, the modern American P-51 at that time, and would possibly be mistaken for that if somebody were looking up at the aircraft at a glance and not knowing maybe what the engines sound like and that type of thing too. So basically what happens is they start heading towards Ulithi Atoll, and basically by this time we're getting closer to the end of the war now.
But news from home would send shockwaves through the crews of the 4 submarines just before their mission would be carried out.
On or about August 15th of 1945, the war ends. On the I-400 itself, our interviewee, Takahashi, was in the radio room, actually near the radio room here when the news came. And they heard, the radio men were listening to a broadcast from Hirohito, basically discussing that the war is now over. And the crew are basically shocked. Now you got to realize that the radio men are hearing this before Commander Kusaka is even hearing this, and the crew. They don't, Takahashi, other than being a pilot on board the submarine, he didn't really have any duty, so he could wander the ship and eat and do most anything, that of leisure, whatever there was to do, whether it was read or write letters or whatever, that type of thing. But now they're listening to this radio broadcast of Hirohito announcing that the war is now over. In disbelief, the crew they don't believe what they're hearing. And it was rebroadcast a few times and stuff like that. Now radio transmissions are coming for different units to surrender. And meanwhile, I400 and I401 are basically waiting for their next orders.
With their mission now canceled, the submarines go their separate ways. On the 22nd of August, 1945, the I-400 receives new orders. Orders that make the reality of the war situation really hit home. They are to scuttle the torpedoes, scuttle the aircraft, and head home to surrender.
For another few days, in disbelief of what they're hearing now as far as scuttling their weaponry and this stuff, they floated around for yet another couple of days and wondering, are we actually hearing to believe what we hear, and this type of thing. Meanwhile, the crew on the submarine, half the crew wants to continue with some kind of mission. The other half of the crew wants to go home because they have wives and families and this kind of thing to return to. So clearly on both submarines, the 401 and 400, there was discussions of continuing some kind of mission. You often hear of this die-hard thing on the Japanese. Well, a lot of them are family people too. A lot of them want to go home and miss their families and that type of thing, and are lucky to be alive and want to return home. So now we're reaching August 26th now, and they've been given a specific order to raise a triangular flag, a triangular black flag, and to surrender their ships after they've scuttled their weaponry and stuff.
The I-400 and I-401, along with 22 other submarines, are transported by the U.S. Navy to Sasebo Bay in the south of Japan for further study. There, the Japanese naval crews train their American counterparts on how to operate the captured vessels. Vice Admiral Griffin, with a detachment of both Navy and Army officers, visits the Sasebo Bay dockyards to inspect the I-402, which had never been launched. The Japanese crew, along with their counterparts on the American prize crew, show the officers around this technological marvel, whose sister ships had come so close to wreaking havoc on America's Navy. It affords a unique opportunity to inspect this rare submarine, its inner workings, and the hold that would have stored the deadly aircraft. The advanced technology inside the hulls of these submarines would make for an excellent prize for any nation to study.
Now the Russians and the British would like one of these trophies. Now, so far the U.S. have been the only ones able to examine these ships here, these massive ships, and take all the data and stuff like that, and the U.S. as usual is not sharing real well. So the British and the Russians request through their channels that they want one of these provided to them. And basically the answer is no.
While 20 of the submarines are packed with explosives and sunk west of Nagasaki, the I-400, I-401, and 2 smaller submarines are sailed to Hawaii, where they are inspected more. But rather than keeping these incredible vessels and using them, commands are given to make sure these advanced submarines do not fall into anyone else's hands.
Once again, from continuous pressure of these foreign governments wanting these Japanese trophies now, 4 trophies, the decision is made to, we've done our research on them now we're going to scuttle them. So it starts off in a progression of some other Japanese submarines that were captured at another time, in the I-200, I-201. And these 2 submarines are taken out on or about March or April and shot through aft torpedo tubes of U.S. Gatto class submarines and sunk off of Barbers Point in Oahu, off of Hawaiian Islands. They picked the location off Barbers Point because of the depth of the waters there, and that these submarines, once sunk, would be hard to to recover. By May of 1946, I401 meets her fate off of Barbers Point. And then lastly, by June of 1946, I400 meets her fate and is torpedoed by the trumpet fish by aft torpedoes into her. Matter of fact, Captain McDowell was asked in June of 1946, when they scuttled I400, whether he wanted to be aboard the trumpet fish when she met her fate. And he was very upset. And granted, he went to his high command saying, this is a tragedy. Number one, it's a tragedy that here we went through all this trouble to capture him. Here it has special technology, and it's a tragedy that we don't keep at least one of these for the Navy to be able to create their own. And what's interesting, even today, it's literally, just from my perspective, it's genius. It's genius that these things were created so in secret, and so many times when people hear about I-400 and their mission and stuff, nobody's ever heard of it. It's incredible. And even that nothing post World War II was ever created.
For almost 20 years, the I-400 class submarines remained the largest in the world. They were the last submarine aircraft carriers to be constructed. In 2005, a team of divers came across the wreck of the I-401 off the coast of Oahu. It was only in 2013 that the I-400 would be found by the same team of divers. The wrecks of these incredible vessels may lie at the bottom of the ocean. But at last, after so many years, the story of their mission has finally resurfaced.
You're watching the Air and Space Channel.